So McFall, I don't have words for this part of the horrors, so I'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, yes, this is a disinformation campaign. Russians have been doing disinformation around the world, in our country, as we've discussed for many years, Nicole, and disinformation works. Propaganda works. When you have the numbers that we do in our country that do not believe that President Biden was elected in a free and fair election, that is hard evidence that propaganda works, and in our country as well as in Russia. But I want to say something else about Russia, because it's a little too dark for me, this conversation. Just because they're propagating propaganda, we shouldn't assume that all Russians believe it. And even if they don't tell us that they don't believe it, we shouldn't assume that they do. And I want to say two things about that. First of all, Russian society is divided just like our society is divided. The more urban, educated, rich, and young you are, the less likely you are to read and believe Putin's propaganda. We know that from public opinion. Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, sits in jail right now. When he was allowed to run for mayor with no resources and no TV, he got a quarter of the vote in Moscow. So remember that. Not all Russians are going for the BS that is on television. It's the exact opposite. The more rural you are, less educated, less wealthy, and older you are, the more likely you are to believe Putin's propaganda.
Ambassador McFall, pull the thread for me then. I mean, because I think most of our allies would say that not all Americans believe that there was fraud in the 2020 election, but it was too close for comfort. And most of our allies worry that Trumpism remains an ascendant virus in the American body politic.
Right. Well, I'll let you and Frank speak about America, but in Russia, it's the exact same thing. There's a core supporters for Putin that will listen to the stories, and they'll see the children dying, and they'll say, well, that's just propaganda from NATO and their Nazi supporters. They'll never be swayed. Then there's another core, a very brave core, thousands of people, I think it's actually more like millions of people in Russia, that don't believe the propaganda. If thousands of people are being arrested and facing 15 years in jail, these brave Russians that we're seeing, that suggests to me that there's a much bigger silent group that has the same preferences but don't want to go to jail for 15 years. I think that's important to remember. And then there's those that are more, in the middle, that could be persuaded. And I agree completely with what Frank said about how it's getting harder and harder. If Putin was doing well, he wouldn't have shut down Echo Moskvy, the largest radio station, independent one. He wouldn't have shut down TV Rain. I fear he's about to shut down YouTube, right? You don't do that if 75% of the people are supporting you. You only do that if you're afraid that you're losing the voters. And that suggests to me that he knows he's losing people. And that means we've got to be smarter about VPNs, text messages to soldiers. There are lots of creative ways to penetrate these kind of places, just as we learned tricks during the Soviet era. And that piece, I think we got to get smarter about. I actually think it's the weakest part so far of the Biden response. NATO support, fantastic. Sanctions, fantastic. Weapons to Ukraine, fantastic. This information piece, there's more work to be done.
Well, you two are two of the smartest people in this space. I mean, Frank, you want to chime in? What does that look like?
So first, I'll take any glimmer of hope that Ambassador McFall's offering, and he's right. And that's where we're going to need to focus that segment of the Russian population, fairly large, that's silent but gets it. And that's where the intelligence community will be focusing, I'm sure. But we're way behind the curve, as the ambassador said, with regard to technological advances way out ahead of us that we've got to get control of. Now, inside the United States, look, it's time for a real battle against disinformation internally and externally. And I think there's understandably great fear of creating some kind of government entity that will immediately be accused of telling Americans what to think. I would never suggest that. But we've got to get much, much better at giving Americans options at the truth, giving the world options to select from when they're making critical decisions, even deadly unlikely decisions, from vaccines to warfare. That's not happening. Social media has got to be regulated. Will that ever happen in this Congress? Probably not. They're not stepping up to the plate enough. Neither are lawmakers. Neither is the executive branch. We're way behind the curve. America's got to get smarter, got to get more savvy at being consumers of information, and it's a global problem. It's certainly not uniquely American.
Well, and I want to, Frank, I want to share something that I really haven't covered all of this since the war started. But the fact that comments like the ones I'm about to share haven't stopped, I want to ask you about them in a national security context. I want to ask you what Vladimir Putin does when Republican candidate J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegies, a highly educated man, says, quote, "I got to be honest with you. I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other. I don't really care." Madison Cawthorn, I can't speak to his education because I really don't know, but these are his words. "Remember that Zelensky is a thug. Remember that the Ukrainian government is incredibly corrupt and it is incredibly evil and has been pushing woke ideologies." So March 10th, the same gentleman, I'm not going to read any more of him, but this is Marjorie Taylor Greene. "NATO has been supplying the neo-Nazis in Ukraine with powerful weapons and extensive training on how to use them." What the hell's going on with these NATO Nazis? What does Putin do with that?
Well, we know from hard evidence that some of the people you mentioned are being featured nightly on the largest news networks within Russia. So people are coming home from work in Moscow and tuning in to people like Madison Cawthorn, Josh Hawley, Tucker Carlson. We had reporting earlier this week, I believe it was Mother Jones, that claims to have their hands on a leaked memo that tells the Russian news agencies, please feature Tucker Carlson prominently on the evening news. So you have to ask yourself, when you're either choosing what to watch here in the United States or you're choosing who to vote for here in the United States, what team are you a part of? Are you going to side with people who are actually becoming operational assets, whether they are witting or not? They are now on notice that they're on evening news in Russia during a time when an adversary is slaughtering innocent women and children. Do you want to be with them or do you want to be on Team America? It's time to make that choice. It's time for the public to speak out loudly on that.
Well, and those politicians should be disqualified for their comments, but it's a sign, back to our earlier conversation of how sick our own politics are. They're not. They're ascendant. I want to, though, take your note about optimism, and it's just not all bleak here, even in the modern Republican Party. Ambassador McFaul, this is Adam Kinzinger dropping some truth bombs of his own.
He was an awful president, and he was awful on this issue. I mean, yeah, there is something to the fact that, nobody knew what Donald Trump was going to do, but that was just because he didn't know what he was going to do. But that was not a deterrent to Putin. Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, Xi, and China were getting everything they wanted with Donald Trump. If anybody tries to look back and say that somehow Donald Trump would have been better at this, it is just utter garbage. And I think anybody in their right mind can't truly believe that. And I think it's time to start telling people the truth. You can be a Republican, you can dislike Joe Biden, but don't pretend like Donald Trump was any good.
I just love that. You can be a Republican, you can dislike Joe Biden, but don't pretend that Donald Trump was any good. I hope that, and I guess I come back to this because the truth is available here from Republicans as well. But, I'll send a case of donuts to anyone that could show me that clip airing on any Fox News show.
Well, that was very powerful, and there is a fight for the soul of the Republican Party that you know better than I, Nicole. It's a real fight, and when I look at it from a national security perspective, what I work on, I'm really confident that we have the better ideas than Putin and Xi Jinping, that Zelensky and the Ukrainians will one day win. I don't know when, but Putin can't crush them with the army that he has or the ideas he's trying to propagate. And in the long run, the world wants us to be strong as a leader of the free world. In the long run, I'm incredibly confident and optimistic about it, with one caveat. We win in the long run against our autocratic adversaries unless we are divided here at home, fighting over these things. And when I see these quotes, I didn't know 2 of the 3 of them that you just put out. Those are blatant. Those are phrases that Putin's using at his rally today. That is really disturbing.